Tractate Temurah covers the various laws of substituting temple offerings for alternative animals. Chapter 1 will begin discussion on these laws. The first Mishnah says, all people can substitute offerings, both men and women. This doesn't mean that a person is allowed to do so. Such a thing is actually forbidden. It just means that if somebody did this, it's effective, and he gets lashes for impermissibly substituting an offering. This is as the verse states, he shall not distinguish between good and bad, nor shall he substitute for it. And if he does substitute for it, then it and its substitute shall be holy, it may not be redeemed. Meaning, it's prohibited to do so, but there are still laws that apply if it's done. The Gemara clarifies, this substituting is impermissible, although it would be effective only after the fact. It said all can do this substitution, to include heirs doing so for their father's offering. Some say this isn't actually permissible, as they say it's derived from smicha, leaning on an offering, which isn't permitted for an heir to do at the end of the consecration process, so similarly, an heir can't substitute an offering at the beginning of consecration. It also sources that an heir does not lean on his father's offering, at least according to this disputing opinion. It's argued if this opinion holds that joint owners of an offering need to lean with smicha on it, and it additionally sources the opinions which say an heir actually can substitute an offering, as they say that just as an offering can be substituted at the beginning of consecration, so too an heir must lean on his father's offering at the end. It additionally sources how we know a woman is subject to these laws of offering substitutions. It is asked if a minor can viably substitute an offering, at least by one who's old enough to make a vow, so he can consecrate an animal in the first place, as on the one hand he can consecrate the animal, but he's also not subject to punishments. And based on this, can a non-Jewish person substitute an offering, as they can consecrate animals, which it then sources. However, on the other hand, a non-Jewish man is not subject to our court punishments of lashes, while a minor eventually will be once he gets older, so perhaps there's a difference. It said they cannot substitute an offering if it's being used to atone for a non-Jewish man. If it's being used to atone for a Jewish man, that's disputed, as to if we go after the consecrator or the man being atoned, so that's left largely unresolved. It said that by a non-Jewish man's offering, their offering cannot be benefited from, like by all other offerings, but that's actually a rabbinic institution, so there's no actual liability for the violation of me'ilah. There's also no liability for improper intent, leftovers, or eating while impure by their offerings, which it sources, and that their offerings aren't substituted also, which is additionally sourced, and also that they don't bring plain libations, but their animal offerings would require a libation, which it also sources. However, it is said by some, the best method is to be stringent and just treat a non-Jewish man's temple offering the exact same way a Jewish man's temple offering is treated. So, some say by a non-Jewish man's items that are consecrated for temple upkeep, there would actually be me'ilah for benefiting from them, as those have monetary sanctity, so they aren't comparable to offering substitution. Regarding the punishment of lashes, some say the only way a punishment of lashes is ever given is if it involved an actual physical act. Evidently, our Mishnah disagrees with this, at least in this respect, as they say there's lashes for substituting an animal offering, which doesn't involve an actual action. Some say there's just exceptions to the principle that lashes are only given to a transgression with a real action, as they say lashes also apply by somebody who takes a false oath, somebody who curses another with God's name, somebody who substituted an offering, and others. It spends some time sourcing these individually, and it disputes what the exact case by the false oath is. Some say it's similar to a vain oath, so essentially for somebody swearing that he ate when he actually hadn't, but it wouldn't include a false oath about a future event, like somebody who swears to eat a loaf of bread and then intentionally doesn't. However, a later source implies that a false oath about a past event actually wouldn't have lashes. It would require an offering in accordance with a disputing opinion. Anyways, some said substituting an animal would actually incur lashes, as they say that his speech accomplishes an action. It sources the fact that cursing another with God's name would incur lashes. Some even said that if somebody separates Temurah tithes before the first fruit tithes, he's liable for lashes, which it additionally cites verses on to source. Although this one is actually subject to dispute, as some say there would be no lashes here, and it quotes who exactly holds these individual opinions. In spite of the fact that this has speech, which we said was enough to cause lashes by an animal substitution, this perhaps wouldn't, as this concept of separating the Temurah tithes before the first fruit tithe is uniquely a prohibition that could be resolved through a positive commandment, which has been established to not have lashes by such a sin. By an offering substitution, there is actually a positive commandment to fix it, but there's still lashes, as it has two transgressions. Related, if a Kohen violates a woman and then marries and then divorces her, he receives lashes, even though that's a prohibition that could be resolved with the positive commandment, but that's just because he's a Kohen, so it's stricter. Anyways, it further disputes as to whether there's lashes for a transgression that doesn't involve an action from some additional particular examples, such as by the paschal offering being left over and similar. Related, if there's a prohibition against an action, and somebody does this, some say his action was effective, hence the punishment for doing so, of lashes, while others say his action was ineffective, and he would be punished simply for violating a commandment from God. So it goes through a whole bunch of different examples to try and determine which way we hold like. For example, if somebody violated a woman, married her, and then divorced her, that's prohibited. There's lashes. So this works according to those that say the action was effective, and those that say it's not effective say the transgression comes from the fact that he's under a constant obligation to remarry her. There's variation on this quoted. There's the prohibition mentioned against separating inferior produce as leads to terumah tithe for superior quality produce. However, that's unique, as a verse specifies that one is called a sinner for doing so. Also, by terumah, it's prohibited to separate one type of food for a different type. So that's another action that's illegal and is considered to be ineffective. But again, that's uniquely based on a verse. Again, by certain consecration vows, they're said to be ineffective if they're done impermissibly. So this is again based on a verse, as it's compared to the bechor tithe. Fine, again, by terumah tithes, it cannot be substituted, but it's effective and there's lashes for doing so, so this would contradict the opinion that says a forbidden action is ineffective, but again, this has a unique status based on verses. But by the bechor firstborn tithe, it said it cannot be redeemed, implying that a forbidden action is ineffective. So again, that's unique based on verses that are discussed at further length. By the maaser offering, it said it cannot be redeemed. Again, apparently an impermissible action is ineffective, and it's said to be different as it's compared to the bechor offering. Fine, what about the concept of separating the terumah tithe before the bikurim first fruits, which is said to be valid, disproving the other opinion that says an impermissible action is not effective, so once again, it has a unique status, which is described. By a widow marrying a Kohen Gadol, it said the betrothal is effective, yet impermissible. Again, it's a unique exception. By the case of consecrating blemished offerings, that's said to be valid and impermissible. Again, it's a unique exception based on verses. By consecrating unblemished animals towards temple upkeep, that's impermissible and effective, as it's the same way blemished animals are sanctified even if they're designated to be offered on the altar. By the prohibition against stealing, there's a requirement for repayment, but there's still acquisition, only that's an impermissible effective act, so that's explained to be unique as it's only returned if it hasn't undergone any changes. There's a prohibition against illegally taking collateral, although it's said to be effective, again that's a unique exception. By not leaving Peah, field charity, it's said to be ineffective if somebody violated this. And once again, it's explained to be an exception based on a verse. The actual dispute between these opinions as to whether an impermissible act is effective or not is specifically by prearranged interest on a loan, which is of course prohibited as it's a dispute if this is effective as to whether it must then be returned. Others disagree and say this is actually a dispute that's not on this principal argument, it's based on some verses. So actually it's explained there's just literally no practical case where there's a difference between these two opinions. It's just how they'd respond differently to all of the past suggested cases over the past few pages. There's variation on this conversation. It also additionally sources the principle that a consecrated blemished animal cannot be used as an offering, and it further covers principles on the Azazel he-goat offering, explaining that a blemished animal cannot be consecrated as such an offering. There are about 5 prohibitions violated if somebody consecrates a blemished animal: to not consecrate it, to not slaughter it, to not throw its blood, to not burn all of it, and to not burn part of it. Now, some add a 6th, to not receive the blood, which they then source, and it discusses some variation on this conversation. It also says these prohibitions against consecrating a blemished animal apply from when it was blemished after its birth. Some suggest there's no prohibition against consecrating an animal that was blemished from birth, as we presume that he only meant to consecrate its value, but that's disputed. Some say there's uniquely a prohibition, as unlike consecrating wood or similar, this is actually disrespectful. This would mean even if the blemished animal was sold to have the proceeds used for libations, there would be lashes, as again, it's disrespectful. It further proves this principle. New Mishnah. The Kohanim can substitute offerings with their own consecrated animals, and Yisraelim can substitute with their own consecrated animals. Kohanim cannot substitute a chatas, an asham, or a bechor that were given by a Yisrael. This is as a bechor is a kohanic gift, just like the chatas and asham, and we know they can't substitute a chatas or asham, so they can't do so to a bechor. By the chatas and asham, the Kohen doesn't receive any monetary rights to the animals, unlike by a bechor, but they're still comparable, as they all had their sanctity begin when the Yisrael owner had them. The Gemara says, it's taught that a bechor can be sold by a Kohen if it's alive and unblemished, and if it's blemished, whether it's alive or dead, the Kohen can still use it, even to betroth a woman, for example. This is explained to apply nowadays when the Kohen gets the monetary rights to an animal. When the temple stands, it's offered in the temple, so the Kohen can't sell it. It quotes a case that's explained to say the same principle. Again, it quotes a few other similar cases that are explained to be in accordance with this established principle. These are additionally discussed. However, some suggest that it's actually disputed as to whether a live, unblemished bechor, firstborn during the temple era, if the Kohen can have the monetary rights to such an animal. We said the Kohen can sell the unblemished bechor while it's alive, according to some. This is clarified to only be allowed for a Kohen to sell it to another Kohen, as if a Yisrael was purchasing it, it would resemble a Kohen assisting with threshing to receive terumah tithes, which is a wrong thing to do. It quotes some relevant cases on this. New Mishnah. A person can make a substituted offering of sheep or goat for cattle, or vice versa, or of goats for sheep, of a male for a female, or vice versa, or of unblemished animals for blemished animals, or vice versa. Of course, the verse for this last one, as it says, the animal could be substituted bad for good, meaning an unblemished animal can be substituted for a blemished one. The Gemara further sources these remaining points about the validity of substituting all the other types of animals which are discussed at length. The case of substituting one's own animal with somebody else's animal must be with a general consecrated animal and one's own unconsecrated animal. So if the consecrated animal's owner said anybody can substitute with theirs if they want to, then this man could do so. New Mishnah, somebody can make a substitution for one animal with two animals, or 2 for 1, or even 1 for 100, or 100 for 1. Some disagree and say one animal can only be substituted with one animal, as is implied by the verse. The Gemara further disputes the sources between these opinions as to whether the singular or plural word for animals are used. According to the opinion that it can only be a substitution of 1 for 1, there's a dispute if he'd hold a single animal can be repeatedly consecrated, which it then disputes. Also, according to his opinion, by an asham offering for atonement that was substituted, and then the original offering became blemished, so it was deconsecrated and redeemed for another animal, and then the replacement was lost, so he atoned through a new replacement animal, and then the original was found. Can he then resubstitute this animal as the original was substituted? And he says you can only substitute once, but it was replaced, so it's a different animal. So this is a double question, as it's a different animal and a different degree of sanctity, so that stands unresolved. There's another variation of this whole conversation that's quoted. Related to this topic, it said if somebody redeems property that has primary sanctity, a fifth is added. If it's secondary sanctity, meaning it's from a pre-existing source, a fifth is not added. That's sourced. So if somebody designates an asham offering to atone and it was blemished, so he adds a fifth and redeems it onto another animal, and the replacement was lost. So he was atoned through a new animal, and the lost animal was found and was designated as an ola instead, and then that was blemished and needs to be redeemed as it switched offering types, but it's technically a secondary sanctity. So would a fifth be added here? Again, this is a double question, as it has these two factors of the differing bodies and the differing levels of sanctity. Again, that's unresolved, and it then quotes a variant of this entire discussion. If somebody consecrated his own animal for somebody else's atonement, and the animal was blemished, so it now requires redemption, we said a fifth is added, and it is done by the man who actually sanctified the item, not by the one who was atoned through it. However, the one who was atoned is considered the owner to be able to substitute it, which it further sources. New Mishnah. In regards to substituting an offering, it's not allowed to substitute unconsecrated limbs for consecrated animal fetuses, and you can't substitute unconsecrated fetuses for consecrated limbs. Also, unconsecrated fetuses or limbs cannot be substituted for consecrated whole animals, or vice versa. Some say it would be valid to substitute unconsecrated limbs for consecrated whole animals, but not vice versa. This is as normally if somebody designates the leg of an animal as an ola, that's valid, and it would make the entire animal an ola. So too, somebody can substitute an unconsecrated animal leg to an entire consecrated animal. The Gemara disputes as to whether an animal fetus can be consecrated if it's by itself, as some say such a thing can have a sanctified status, and others disagree. Those that say it can have such a status say that if somebody consecrated a pregnant animal as a chatas and it gave birth, he can be atoned either through the animal or its offspring. This is additionally mentioned, as he's not even consecrating the fetus here, he consecrated the pregnant mother. It quotes variation of this discussion. We said there's a dispute if an animal fetus can be consecrated. Some would concede that it could still have monetary sanctity, and also that such a status would prevent it from getting the sanctity of being a firstborn. It further quotes cases disputing as to whether an animal fetus alone can acquire physical sanctity. It additionally disputes between these opinions. In the end, it concedes that an unblemished fetus in the womb of an unblemished animal can be physically consecrated. The dispute only exists by an unblemished fetus inside of a blemished animal, as there it's a dispute as to whether or not the fetus has the same status of its blemished mother. There's variation on this discussion that's quoted. Now, there was that opinion which stated by a consecrated animal, if somebody designates its leg as an ola, the whole animal is an ola. It mentions this is actually a disputed point. Some say this would only apply if a vital individual limb was consecrated, that it would then spread to the entire animal. Although it is agreed if the consecrated organ was something that, if removed, would give the animal a defect, or according to others, possibly would make it improperly slaughtered, or according to others, possibly that it would kill the animal, it's fully sanctified. These variations dispute as to essentially whether something with a defect can live or not, and whether, if the animal's thigh is removed, whether that makes it have the status of improperly slaughtered. So essentially it's one of these three options that's something which the soul is dependent on, and it's agreed if such an organ is consecrated, the whole animal would also be. By a bird that only part of it is consecrated, that's unresolved. Also, if a single limb of an animal was consecrated for its monetary value, do we say that the whole animal has monetary sanctity, or do we say that and then it would have physical sanctity? So that is also unresolved. Further, if a single limb was consecrated, it's unresolved as to whether the prohibition against shearing a consecrated animal would apply to the whole thing. If an animal's skin was consecrated, it argues if the animal can still be worked with. This is definitely rabbinically prohibited, but as to whether it's even biblically prohibited, that's unresolved. If a pregnant animal was consecrated as a shlomim offering, excluding the fetus, and it was slaughtered inside the temple, according to those that would say the fetus would only be consecrated once it's actually born, would this constitute slaughtering an unconsecrated animal inside the temple? It's explained there would be no problem here. Also, if the animal was unconsecrated but the fetus was a shlomim and it was slaughtered outside the temple, again, there would be no issue of slaughtering the consecrated fetus outside the temple when the mother is killed. New Mishnah. Produce of a forbidden mixture of terumah tithes and regular foods don't create a new forbidden mixture when mixed with other regular foods, unless the actual terumah exceeds 1/100th of the mixture. If regular dough and leavened terumah dough mix, they don't make another amount of dough leavened by the terumah unless the original terumah exceeds this 1/100th of the mixture. Drawn water cannot disqualify a mikveh except according to this calculation. The purification of a red heifer only becomes purification waters once the ashes are placed on them. A plowed graveyard cannot be plowed further to extend its impurity into other fields. Terumah cannot be separated from terumah. It is a dispute if the offspring of a consecrated animal can substitute for it. The Gemara describes who authored this based on individually held opinions. We said a regular dough and terumah mixture cannot leaven other doughs as terumah unless it exceeds its terumah ratio. Others actually disagree and say that it just goes by whatever fell in last. The remaining points are explained. When it says drawn water doesn't disqualify a mikveh, it actually means except according to the ratio of vessels, as it said that if 3 lugan measures of drawn water fall into a mikveh, if they contain 2 or 3 vessels of drawn water, they disqualify the mikveh. If it was more than this, it would be fine. It sources the opinion who holds that the purification of the red heifer is by the placement of the ashes, which must be done after the water is placed in the vessel, as he holds the water as a non-essential aspect. Again, there's a disagreeing opinion which says a plowed graveyard field can actually be extended further, and it sources who holds terumah cannot be taken from terumah, along with the remaining points. New Mishnah. Bird and mincha offerings cannot be substituted, as the verse which discusses substitution speaks only of animals. A community and partners cannot substitute an offering, only an individual can do so. Animals consecrated for temple upkeep cannot be substituted. Verses are quoted. The Gemara additionally elaborates on these sources at length. These are additionally discussed, and that's the end of chapter 1.